All right, everyone. So we've got a little bit of a different lecture today. We're going to be covering sport and exercise in diverse populations. So we're going to start off by looking at cultural diversity in Australia as a whole, and then we'll go on to talk about three specific populations. So we'll discuss Indigenous Australians, persons with disability, and then finally look at those with different gender identities or different sexual orientations. Now, we know all too well by now that physical activity is important for all Australians, particularly in the prevention and management and also treatment of chronic diseases or chronic conditions, and also for things like social and emotional well-being. So to start off with part one, Australia has a very unique history that's shaped the diversity of our population, our culture, and our lifestyles. So there's three major contributors to Australia's demographic makeup, and those are our diverse Indigenous population, our British colonial past, and our extensive immigration from many different countries and cultures. So today, Australia's population is getting close to 25 million, and we are one of the most culturally diverse populations in the world. So since 1945, almost 7 million people have migrated to Australia. So this cultural diversity, it's really central to our national identity. And cultural diversity is defined as the peaceful coexistence of people from different traditions, different customs, and different cultures. Just over 1 in 4 Australians were born overseas. So that's almost a quarter, that's more than a quarter of Australians being born overseas. So 28%. Almost 50% of our population has a parent who was born overseas. And nearly 20% of Australians speak a language other than English at home. And if we have a look even closer here, we can see that 11 in 100 Australians have a diverse sexual orientation or gender identity. We see here that there's 4.2 million people with a disability in Australia, and there's 3.5 million people with hearing impairments. We also see that the Indigenous population is growing within Australia. So in 1975, the Racial Discrimination Act came into play. This made discrimination in different parts of public life actually illegal and against the law. However, despite this legal protection, there's far too many people in Australia who continue to experience prejudice and unfair treatment because of how they look or where they come from. So unfortunately, 1 in 10 Australians, that's 1.5 million people, believe that some races are inferior or superior to others. Around 20% of Australians have experienced race hate talk, and 11% have experienced race-based social exclusion. Additionally, 6% of Australians have reported physical attacks based on their race or their traditional dress, and 19% have reported discrimination because of their skin color, ethnic origin, or religion. So people born in countries where English isn't the main language spoken are actually 3 times more likely to experience discrimination in the workplace and twice as likely to experience discrimination in education. So whilst that is all bad news, there have been some positive developments in the recent years. Lately, most new migrants say they feel a really strong sense of belonging to Australia, and that feeling deepens over the time that they spend here. We also know that most Australians, it's around 86% of Australians, support action to tackle racism in Australia. Now, multiculturalism, which is different to diversity, encompasses government measures designed to respond to the cultural diversity that exists within our society. So the Commonwealth Government has identified 3 dimensions of multicultural policy. There's cultural identity, which is the right of all Australians within carefully defined limits to express and share their individual cultural heritage. This includes things like their language and their religion. The second dimension is social justice, which is the right of all Australians to equality of treatment and opportunity and the removal of barriers of race, ethnicity, culture, religion, language, gender, or place of birth. And then there's finally economic efficiency, which is the need to maintain, develop, and utilize effectively the skills and talents of all Australians, regardless of background. All right, so what about now if we have a look at sport and inclusion? Now, sport and physical activity play a really important role in our communities by promoting social inclusion as well as community well-being. However, sport can also promote exclusion and place unnecessary barriers to greater community participation. So, to be inclusive is by providing a range of opportunities or options to cater for people of all ages, abilities, and backgrounds in the most appropriate manner possible. If we have a look at some of Australia's national sporting organisations, these ones listed here have developed and implemented their own inclusive sport framework. So Swimming Australia, Golf Australia, Netball Australia, and also the National Rugby League. So we know that the reality of Australia is that our culturally, linguistically, and gender diverse communities are looking for sporting options that celebrate diversity, that promote inclusion, and make them feel like they belong. So inclusivity in sport, it's not just about not excluding people, it's more about actively trying to include them. So let's have a closer look at the inclusion framework of the NRL.
My name's Todd Greenberg. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the National Rugby League. It gives me great pleasure to announce our new anti-discrimination and vilification frameworks here today. As a game, we're committed to providing a sport that's free from discrimination and one that promotes respectful and positive behaviours. The contents of these frameworks outline our mission to be a game that is safe, welcoming, and inclusive for all. Rugby League has a significant voice amongst our communities, and we must continue to use our voice to share messages of respect and positive behaviours towards everyone in our game and beyond. I'd like to thank the Australian Human Rights Commission in particular for their dedication in helping the NRL shape these important frameworks. I'd also like to thank all of our players, our clubs, our states, our fans, and particularly our staff who've helped us along the way to shape these very important policies and put this framework in place. Together, we will continue to stand up, speak out, and take action as we continue to lead the way to have an inclusive game.
Now, the NRL is definitely not immune to issues of discrimination, racism, or exclusion. There's incidents which occur on the field, in the stands, and even via online environments like social media. So constant education is required for the NRL to remain at the forefront to promote inclusive practices and address racism and discrimination when it occurs. So this is why they've included this inclusion framework and the anti-discrimination and vilification framework. Now, the 7 pillars of inclusion, which is the framework developed by the Australian Sports Commission and used by the National Rugby League, has been used as the basis of the development of this inclusion framework. So the 7 pillars include access, attitude, choice, partnerships, communication, policy, and opportunities. So this framework, it can be applied across the board for Indigenous people or disabled people, for the inclusion of women or the inclusion of people from different cultural backgrounds to participate in sport. All right, so in this introduction of the lecture, we've seen that Australia has a very diverse multicultural population. We've seen that sport can be used for positive social change by helping build more inclusive and happier and safer communities. And then finally, we saw that the inclusive practices in sport, like adopting inclusion frameworks, can help to increase the participation and improve physical, social, mental, and spiritual health and well-being among all different populations. Okay, so on to part 2 of this lecture. So now we're going to discuss the physical activity trends in Indigenous populations and how this contributes to overall health and well-being. Now, we know that where you live, your socioeconomic status, whether you have a disability, and your access to health services can affect your overall health. And we see that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experience more health disadvantages than other Australians. Now, these disadvantages include higher rates of illness and also a shorter life expectancy. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up approximately 3% of Australia's total population. In 2019, the estimated Australian Indigenous population was almost 800,000. Now, New South Wales had the highest number of Indigenous people, so around 200,000, which is 31% of the total Indigenous population, all being in New South Wales. And you can see the colours there, the darkest colours around New South Wales. However, it was the Northern Territory that had the highest proportion of Indigenous people in its population. So 30% of the total population in the Northern Territory is Indigenous. So even though New South Wales had the greatest number of Indigenous people, we also have a much higher number of just people in total. Whereas in the Northern Territory, that's where there's the greatest proportion of Indigenous people, so the greatest percentage of the population. Now, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, good health includes physical, social, emotional, cultural, and spiritual well-being. And unfortunately, there is a pretty significant health gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So Indigenous Australians have a shorter life expectancy than non-Indigenous Australians, and babies born to Aboriginal mothers die at more than twice the rate of other Australian babies. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people also experience higher rates of preventable illnesses such as heart disease, kidney disease, and diabetes. So additionally, we see here that Indigenous Australians are 2.7 times more likely to smoke. They're 2.1 times more likely to die before their 5th birthday, and 1.7 times more likely to have a disability or restrictive long-term health condition. Now, there are some differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians that help explain this health gap. So Indigenous Australians on average have lower levels of education, employment, income, and they also have poorer quality housing than non-Indigenous Australians. Indigenous Australians also, on average, have higher rates of smoking and risky alcohol consumption. They also exercise less and have a greater risk of high blood pressure compared to non-Indigenous Australians. And finally, Indigenous Australians are also more likely to report difficulty in accessing affordable health services that are nearby. So overall, Indigenous Australians experience a widespread socioeconomic disadvantage and health inequality. However, in recent years, there have been a number of improvements, which is good news. So, there's been a significant decline in child mortality rates, so deaths between 0 and 4 years, from 217 deaths per 100,000 in 1998 down to 146 deaths per 100,000 in 2016. We also see that between 2005 and 2012, the gap in life expectancy at birth between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians has decreased. So from 11.4 to 10.6 years for males, and from 9.6 to 9.5 years for females. So a slight decrease in the difference between the life expectancy there. Additionally, there have been improvements in behavioural risk factors in Indigenous populations in the recent years as well. So smoking rates among Indigenous Australians have declined from 51% in 2012 to 42% in 2015. This decline was more concentrated in non-remote areas. We also saw that in 2014 to 15, 15% of Indigenous people aged 15 and over reported that they drank alcohol at risky levels. So that's a decrease from what it was previously in 2008 at 19%. We've also seen previously that better education leads to better health. And in 2016, 47% of Indigenous Australians had completed Year 12, compared to only 37% in 2011. So that's quite a big difference there. That's a 10% difference in only 5 years. If we have a look now at the current physical activity levels among Indigenous populations, we see that 64% of Indigenous children aged 4 to 14 years old had taken part in some form of physical activity or sport at one time in the previous 12 months. And that rate was similar between males and females. Now, only 30% of Indigenous people aged over 15 years had taken part in some form of physical activity or sport in the previous 12 months. So here in the adulthood period, we see that participation levels were higher among Indigenous males, so at 38%, compared to Indigenous females who were at around 23%. So quite a substantial difference between males and females there. We also see a similar trend with this drop off in the physical activity with increasing age, and we've seen that many times before in non-Indigenous Australians when we're looking at the physical activity level of the population as a whole. If we further compare Indigenous to non-Indigenous populations, we find that a lower proportion of Indigenous adults aged 18 to 16 met the physical activity guideline compared with non-Indigenous adults of this age. So 38% of Indigenous people compared with 46% of non-Indigenous people. We also see that 13% of Indigenous adults met the strength-based activity guideline compared to 21% of non-Indigenous adults of the same age. And this pattern was evident among both men and women. We also see that only 8.8% of Indigenous adults met both the physical activity and strength-based activity guideline, and that's compared with 15% of non-Indigenous adults of the same age. So if we have a look at that graph on the right-hand side, we can see that the non-Indigenous participants in the lighter blue colour outperform the Indigenous participants in the darker blue colour in every aspect of those guidelines. Now, Indigenous people also report higher proportions of sedentary or low activity levels than non-Indigenous people. The highest sedentary levels for Indigenous people were seen here in New South Wales, so 52% of Indigenous people in New South Wales being sedentary, and then a further 27% being low activity levels. Between 2001 and 2005, the level of being sedentary among Indigenous people aged 15 years and older increased dramatically. So from 37 to 47% in just 4 years. So big increase in sedentary behavior. The disparity between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in being sedentary also increased between these times, so from 11% to 18%. So we see that Indigenous people are really being affected by the sedentary behavior epidemic. So why is it? Why are Indigenous people less active than non-Indigenous people? Now, the Indigenous community faces many barriers in the engagement of physical activity, and these barriers can be cultural, so things like the perceptions of health, inclusion of family or community, and concepts of time or structure. They can be geographical barriers, such as physical location, environment, terrain, and climate. So many Indigenous people live in rural or remote areas. And they can be socioeconomic barriers to participation as well. This includes things like resources, accessibility, transport, and costs. Factors such as age, gender, cultural group, and also socioeconomic status can influence individual engagement with physical activity. And also, in some cases, being healthy is actually a low priority for some Indigenous people, particularly older women who may place a higher focus on their family than themselves. So chronic diseases are a major contributor to this health gap between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders compared to other Australians. So about 80% of the mortality gap for people aged 35 to 74 years is due to chronic diseases, and the major contributors being ischemic heart disease, diabetes, liver diseases, any other form of heart disease, so coronary heart disease, heart failure. There's chronic lower respiratory diseases, so mainly talking about chronic obstructive pulmonary disease here, and then also cerebrovascular disease. So we know that physical activity can positively influence the development of cardiovascular disease. Now, of all Indigenous people living with cardiovascular disease, almost 2/3, so 58%, were physically inactive. And that's a level that's 1.6 times higher than the non-Indigenous population. So physical activity accounts for 30% of the disease burden of cardiovascular disease in the Indigenous population. Some of the other main contributors are tobacco smoking, which is 33%, high body mass, which is 31%, and high cholesterol, also at 31%. In comparison, physical inactivity accounts for only 24% of the disease burden of cardiovascular disease in the total population of Australia. We also know that physical activity and exercise can positively influence the prevention and management of type 2 diabetes. It can reduce the likelihood of developing diabetes and also help to reverse high sugar levels. So in 2015, 11% of Indigenous adults had diabetes, and that's 3 times the rate of non-Indigenous Australians. So for Indigenous people living with diabetes, 42% of them have multiple chronic diseases. So the burden of diabetes among Indigenous people that's caused by physical inactivity is almost 1/3, so 31%. All right, so if we have a quick look at sport now, over the past decade, a number of sporting organisations have developed programs that specifically target Indigenous populations. These programs have often been in partnership with Australian or state and territory governments, and most of them are linked to trying to close that health gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. The AFL in particular has been very successful in transitioning players from development programs into its elite competitions. So Indigenous players make up more than 10% of the AFL roster. There's many other sporting organisations that also hold Indigenous rounds, like the NRL, Super Netball League, also Cricket Australia, which holds the Impaja Cup as well. If we have a look at some of the trends and the benefits of sports participation in Indigenous populations, we see that mental health is said to be better among Indigenous people who participate in organised sport. Indigenous adults who played sport in the previous year reported higher life satisfaction than those who didn't participate in any sport. We also see that Indigenous adults who played sport report more frequent social contact, and they're more likely to feel like they have a social support network outside of their household. We also see that 56% of Indigenous children who participated in sport were assessed as being in excellent health, compared to 48% of those who had not participated in organised sport. So overall, sport can contribute to community identity and serve as a focal point for engagement, pride, and achievement. The diversity of sports and sporting activities makes it a really ideal platform to try and reach individuals from every age group, every culture, and all socioeconomic backgrounds. So overall, in this part of the lecture, we've seen that Indigenous Australians have a shorter life expectancy than non-Indigenous Australians due to various health gaps. On average, Indigenous Australians are less physically active than non-Indigenous Australians. And we also see that increased participation in sport and physical activity results in positive health and psychosocial outcomes. All right, so we're going to spend some time now looking at persons with a disability. Now, we know that a physically active lifestyle is accompanied by many health and fitness benefits, and individuals with a disability can certainly benefit from increasing their activity and exercise. Now, disability is defined as any limitation, restriction, or impairment that restricts everyday activities and lasts for at least 6 months. Now, often people think of disability in its most extreme form, like being bound to a wheelchair or having a significant intellectual disability. However, most disabilities are actually far more subtle. Now, a disability is diagnosed as the presence of one or more of these 15 limitations, restrictions, or impairments. So something like loss of sight that can't be corrected by glasses, loss of hearing, speech difficulties, having blackouts or fits of loss of consciousness, slowness at learning or understanding, or the incomplete use of arms or fingers. And now there's many more there that you can read in your own time. Some of the common types of disability include vision impairment, deaf, mental health conditions, intellectual disabilities, brain injuries, autism spectrum disorders, and physical disabilities. So there's many different kinds of disability and a wide variety of situations that these people experience. So the disability can be permanent or temporary, and it may exist from birth or be acquired later in life. So let's have a look at some of the key statistics for disability in Australia. Now, in 2018, 4.4 million Australians had a disability. So that's 17.7%. And that is actually a slight decrease from back in 2015. The rate of disability between males and females was very similar, and mental health problems or mental illnesses were among the greatest causes of disability. So almost 1/4 of all people with a disability reported a mental or behavioral disorder as their main condition, and that number has actually increased. If we have a look at the rate of disability across different age groups here, we can see that disability generally increases with age for both males and females. Now, 3.7% of 0 to 4-year-olds had a disability, and that increases all the way up to 84.6% of those aged over 90. So 1 in 9 people aged 0 to 64 have a disability, and that increases to 1 in 2 people aged 65 and over who have a disability. If we have a look at the physical activity trends in these people with a disability, the Ausplay data indicates that 78% of people who have a disability participated in sport or physical activity at least once in the last 12 months. 69% participated at least once per week, and then 52% of people with a disability participated in sport or physical activity at least 3 times per week. Now, these figures were significantly lower than for people surveyed who did not have a disability. So of those who do not have a disability, 91% participated at least once in the last 12 months. At least once per week was 83%, and then at least 3 times per week was 64% of people with no disability. So what are the reasons why there's such a difference in the participation level of people with and without a disability? Why do people with a disability participate so much less in physical activity? So the barriers and facilitators of physical activity have been investigated in disabled populations. The findings revealed that there's several different barriers or facilitators associated with physical activity participation in persons with a disability. Now, these reasons can either be grouped into personal or environmental factors. Personal barriers to exercise were the type of disability that the individual was suffering from and their current health status and energy level. Environmental barriers were the lack of facilities, lack of transport, or difficulties with accessibility. If we have a look at the facilitators now, personal facilitators included fun and health, and then environmental facilitator was the social contact. The experience of barriers and facilitators to sports participation depends a lot on the age and mainly the type of disability. That's the main factor that influences whether someone is going to participate in sport or not. And these all need to be considered when advising people or disabled people about what sports they should consider. Now, the extent of sports participation for people with physical disabilities increases when they find the most appropriate sport. So the main thing in getting people with a disability to participate in sport is really finding what they're going to be good at and what they're going to enjoy, and then being able to get them there, get the accessibility and the opportunity happening. So if we have a look now at a model of physical activity behavior and its relationship with functioning and disability, this model here describes how physical activity function, which encompasses those 3 middle factors. It encompasses body functions and structures, activities, and participation. So the model describes how physical activity function is influenced by these environmental and personal factors. So functioning is the umbrella term that's used for all 3 levels: body functions and structures, activity, and participation. We spoke about a couple of the environmental factors just before, but they also include things like family, friends, colleagues, health professionals and their opinions, as well as the transportation, availability, and accessibility of facilities, having assistance from others, and available equipment. Personal factors include the individual's health condition, whether that's a disease, a disorder, a previous injury, or perhaps some trauma. It also includes things like energy, time, money, motivation, the person's skills, their age, their gender, and also their attitude and intention to participate in physical activity. Now, despite the fact that personal and environmental factors may be heavily influencing this gap between the amount of physical activity done by persons with and persons without a disability, the great thing about here in Australia is that opportunities for engagement in physical activity for disabled people are constantly growing. So Disability Sports Australia is an organisation that's committed to enabling more Australians with a disability to be more active. There's a huge amount of sports which are now accessible to persons with a disability, and some of these include things like adaptive surfing, archery, many different types of track and field events. There's football, swimming, also all the wheelchair sports such as basketball, AFL, and wheelchair tennis. There's gymnastics, lawn bowls, and even powerlifting now as well. Persons with a disability also now have access to a high performance sport pathway through the Paralympic movement as well. All right, now what if we have a look at the development of disability that often occurs with aging? We saw previously that 1 in 2 people aged 65 years and over meet the disability criteria. So the risk of disability, it's related to both a lower level of physical activity and reduced physical capacity. So things like strength, aerobic capacity, reduced balance, and reduced flexibility. Also, there's certain diseases that are implicated in the development of disability, and often these diseases are more prevalent in sedentary individuals. Therefore, the exercise prescription for the prevention of disability should focus on 4 goals: changing sedentary behavior to a more active lifestyle, modifying risk factors for disability and disability-related diseases, risk factors such as visceral obesity, sarcopenia, hypertension, and insulin resistance. Number 3 is either maintaining or improving exercise capacity in all domains, so muscular and cardiovascular function, as well as balance. And then number 4 is enhancing psychosocial functioning. Now, physical activity can influence the development and the expression of disability in old age in many different ways. There's a big overlap between the identifiable risk factors for disability and the consequences of physical inactivity. So these factors are summarized here in this table. We can see the risk factors associated with disability listed here. So the risk factors for disability include things like aging, lower socioeconomic status, being of not Caucasian ethnicity, smoking, obesity, depression, sarcopenia, and the last 2 risk factors listed on this table being decreased muscular capacity and impaired gait or balance. Now, these 2 are bolded because they are the 2 biggest risk factors for the development of disability, as generally these 2 are the biggest causes of falls in older age, and we know that falls can lead to a significantly reduced functional capacity. So anyone with any of these listed risk factors has a greater likelihood of developing a disability. And we can see that all of these factors are associated with having a sedentary lifestyle. We also see that more than half of these risk factors can be avoided or reduced with exercise. So obviously with exercise, we can't stop aging, we can't improve our socioeconomic status or change our ethnicity just by exercising. But some studies have suggested that exercise might improve the adherence to other behavioral changes, things like smoking cessation or is associated with a greater social network. However, these factors aren't really firmly established, so that's why those 3 have a question mark next to them. So overall, this table shows that physical activity levels are pretty strongly associated with the development of disability in older adults. Now, exercise may also work to help prevent and treat disability through risk factor modification, disease prevention, and the treatment of already established diseases. So this table here provides a summary of the benefits of different exercise modalities for actually treating diseases, or impairments or psychological factors that might be contributing to disability. So we can see muscle weakness, and that definitely benefits from resistance training. Obesity, which benefits from aerobic or resistance training. And then we've got frailty, which benefits by including all three modalities, aerobic, resistance, and balance training as well. So overall, in this part of the lecture, we've seen that people with a disability in Australia are less physically active than persons without a disability, and the participation in physical activity for people with a disability is highly influenced by both environmental as well as personal factors, the main factor being what the actual disability is. And we also see that physical activity levels are related to the development of disability in older adults. So exercise can help prevent and treat some of the factors that might influence our risk of disability. All right, so on to the last part of the lecture, looking at gender and sexual identity. Now, sport is often perceived as embodying these positive values and morals, things like cooperation, respect, fair play, and equality. However, sport also has the potential to reflect some pretty undesirable values and unethical behaviors that tend to divide society, particularly around gender and sexual identity. Up to 11 in 100 Australians have a diverse sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, equality and the freedom from discrimination are fundamental human rights that belong to all people, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So in 2013, the Australian Sex Discrimination Act was amended to make discrimination on the basis of a person's sexual orientation or gender identity illegal. So despite this really important step forward, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people in Australia still experience discrimination, harassment, and hostility in many parts of everyday life, whether that's in public, at work, or even in sport. So let's first have a look at some of the typical gender stereotypes associated with sport. Now, unfortunately, in many sporting environments, highly stereotypical views are held about what it means to be masculine or feminine. Gender stereotypes contribute to young women dropping out of sport because women in sport are often seen as being non-feminine. Often you'll hear women in sport being labelled as lesbians or butch or very manly. There's too many stories I've heard of girls who leave the gym because they don't like the muscles that they're gaining from resistance training. I personally know a girl who was told to leave the gym by her partner because he didn't like the way that her trap muscles looked in dresses anymore. So it's a pretty horrible thing for your partner to say to you, but unfortunately that does happen. Similar thing for men as well. Men who don't fulfill the stereotype of being this manly man have reported feeling intimidated or excluded from sports participation. And often, again, these men who are not playing sport will be labelled as gay, regardless of whether or not that's their sexual identity at all. There was quite a controversial photo of women's AFL player Taylor Harris, who's pictured here, that was posted online via the Channel 7 social media. The majority of comments on this one controversial photo were very negative and referred to these traditional gender stereotypes, with lots of men commenting things like "get back in the kitchen." Also, if we are discussing gender, we can't not mention the pretty hugely contentious issue of gender determination. The two most controversial examples being of Caster Semenya and Dutee Chand. So Caster Semenya is a South African athlete and Olympic gold medalist, and she's been in a lot of controversy for most of her career surrounding her genetic differences. So Semenya, she was born and raised as a girl and she has female genitalia. However, she has this 5-alpha reductase deficiency, which means that she has a male XY chromosome and a high level of testosterone, and this is known as hyperandrogenism. Dutee Chand from India also has hyperandrogenism, which is a naturally occurring condition where, as a female with female chromosomes, Dutee has an abnormally high level of testosterone. Now, testosterone undoubtedly plays an important role in sporting performance. It makes muscles bigger, bones stronger, and it increases the level of our oxygen carrying capacity. So, Dutee actually challenged the regulation that excludes female athletes from competing with abnormally high testosterone, and she won her case. So she's just a genetic freak. If you think about all the athletes who are at the top of their sports, they're all genetic freaks. Dutee's hyperandrogenism is a naturally occurring human variation. If she was excluded from competing because of her genetics, where would we stop? How would we make things fair? Would female netballers who are over 6 foot have to be excluded from playing because it's unfair that they're abnormally taller? No, that's not how things would happen. They're just genetically made to be good at netball, just like Dutee's genetic level of testosterone makes her good at her sport. In Caster Semenya's case, things went a little bit differently. So she actually has male chromosomes, indicating that she is intersex. So Semenya lost her appeal and must artificially lower her testosterone levels in order to compete in future events in women's divisions. Alright, so if this is a topic that really interests you, I know that it's a highly contentious topic, and a lot of people want to know more about the hows and the whys the Olympic Committee makes these rulings. I strongly recommend you watch this video on how sex is viewed in sport, and particularly by that Olympic Committee. It's only a 12-minute video up on YouTube, and it talks about how athletes have been categorized into male and female groups across history. So firstly, it started with a visual examination of genitals, then moved into chromosome testing, and now currently we are looking at a testosterone limit for separating the two categories there. But it does go into some of the disadvantages and the potential harms of using this testosterone limit for sex or gender determination within sports. So it's a super interesting video. I'll put it up on Canvas so you guys can easily find the link there. Now, whilst we're talking about the Olympics, it's very important to mention the Tokyo Olympics. Now, transgender athletes have been allowed to compete at the Olympics since 2004, but it was only in 2020 when we saw the first 4 transgender athletes compete. So New Zealand weightlifter Laurel Hubbard, USA Chelsea Wolfe, she was a reserve for the BMX freestyle team. They were the first trans women to represent their countries at the Olympic Games, and they were joined by the US skateboarder Alana Smith and the Canadian soccer player Quinn, who are the first openly transgender non-binary athletes. And Quinn, they took home the gold medal, so the first non-binary person to take home a gold medal in the Olympics for the Canadian soccer team. These athletes competing and Quinn winning the gold medal is huge. It really sends a important message of hope and possibility and helps to debunk the stereotypes of unfair disadvantages that some transgender athletes may have. Now, transgender and non-binary athletes, they often begin 10 steps behind. So they often face struggles with accessing funding, sponsorship, coaching, and just navigating day-to-day society. Now, some transgender people, they're actually discouraged from participating in sport altogether. And we know that transgender people actually have poorer health outcomes, perhaps due to discrimination and access to healthcare, and actively discouraging these people from participating in sport is not going to help that cause. So these athletes, they're breaking down the barriers, but we all still have a long way to go before truly being inclusive in the Olympics and just in sports in general. Now, I saw this graph and I thought it relates very nicely to what we're talking about right now. So women versus men, no one exists in between. So they're two separate sort of beings, I guess, and we all fit into one of those categories. Now, this is a very incorrect representation of the world and the different genders and the way that people identify. What it looks more like day to day is something like this. So we all exist on a spectrum. There's women, there's men, and there's other genders as well. The idea of a spectrum or a continuum is a really important one too, because through everything, even a cis man versus a cis woman, they're on a spectrum. So you could have if I asked you which gender is taller, males or females, you would probably say males. But the tallest female is probably a lot taller than the average man. So you can see how it's a spectrum there, and that works for all sorts of things like testosterone, strength, speed, lung capacity. So we all exist on this spectrum, and that's very important to remember moving forwards. Now, something else that's very important is terminology. So terminology can have a big impact on a person's identity and their level of dignity, and using appropriate terminology really helps to respect individuality and enhances the visibility of transgender and gender diverse people in the community. So we have here the genderbread person. I do appreciate the use of the pun there. Now, it's important to recognize that terminology in this area it's evolving. So this figure provides a general guidance on some relevant terminology. So an understanding of these terms can help to prevent discrimination and create an inclusive environment. So we have gender identity there. That's how you in your head think about yourself. We have gender expression, which is the way that you demonstrate yourself or express yourself. Your biological sex, so this is more on the chromosome level. And then, of course, your sexual orientation, which is also commonly referred to as sexual identity. All right, so let's now have a look at sexual identity. So specifically, we're going to spend some time now talking about the LGBTI community. So that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex. Now, the reported number of same-sex couples has more than tripled between 1996 and 2011. So recently, more people are accepting their sexual identity and being forward with that. So that's a really good thing. Unfortunately, though, we see that gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people are 3 times more likely to experience depression than heterosexual people. We've also seen that in Australia, around 60% of LGBTI people or gender questioning young people say that they've experienced verbal abuse because of their sexuality. So, despite the extensive positive changes in social attitudes towards the LGBTI community in Australia that's occurred over the last decade, research still shows that they experience significant levels of discrimination and abuse. So this out on the field study was the first international and largest study conducted on homophobia in sport. And what they found was that 81% of gay youth and 74% of lesbian youth in Australia actually hide their sexual identity from their teammates. They also found that 73% of LGBTI people in the study believed that homophobia is more common in team sports than the rest of the society in their country. So team sports is a place where these homophobic ideas or homophobic perspectives really are prevalent. The study also found that gay men are less likely to play team sports than lesbian women, and potentially that might be because abuse among men is more likely to be physical as well as verbal. So they're worried for their physical safety as well as the verbal harassment that they might receive. So LGBTI people are definitely still experiencing significant levels of discrimination and abuse, particularly in the sporting setting. Now, in order to combat this, the Gay Games was initiated. So the Gay Games, it's inspired by the Olympics. It occurs every 4 years with people from all around the world, and it's this premier athletic event of LGBTI individuals. The mission of this Gay Games is based on inclusivity. So that is any interested person can participate regardless of their gender, their sexual orientation, their physical ability or competitive level, their age, nationality, race, religion, whatever, political beliefs. You all can compete in the Gay Games. And the response to these Gay Games, then the people who participate in it most frequently describe it as an empowering and personally transformative experience. So let's have a look at a video on the Gay Games.
Free to fight and be themselves, wrestlers warming up at the 10th Gay Games in Paris. Growing up, Paco loved combat sports. When he was younger, it was all about judo. But he had to wrestle with two sides, being gay and a judoka. Homophobia meant he felt he could not be both.
I was hearing constant criticism and insults against us gays. People would say, it's not really a sport for fairies. This isn't really a sport for faggots. So it really became difficult to hear all these insults, to keep it all inside. So I had to find a way to express myself fully. Because there was a part of me that was wrestling, but another part of me I couldn't really express.
It wasn't until Paco joined an LGBT wrestling club that he no longer had to choose. Just like him, the athletes at the Gay Games are safe to be out, proud, and competing in the sports they love. More than 10,000 participants from 91 countries are competing in 36 disciplines here in France.
Welcome to the city of freedom and of love. Thank you for being here.
But back home, some have to hide their sexuality when they compete. There are athletes here from 20 countries where homosexuality is illegal, and for the organisers, the 2018 Football World Cup showed how far sport still has to go to battle discrimination.
In Russia, there wasn't a single openly gay player. It's completely incredible. You can't have one part of the population represented in sport.
No matter your background, gender, sexuality or physical capability, the games are open to all. And for many like Alessandro, it's the first time they've competed in an LGBT event. He used to fence for Italy, but as a teenager decided he had had enough of being bullied and left the sport. Years later, he found an inclusive club in London and was able to pick up the sword again as a gay man. And here in Paris, he's found he's no longer the only one.
This is the first time I've actually met gay fencers, and there's actually quite a few of us here. Clearly sends a message that we are there, It might help people that were, they're younger and they look at us and say, oh, actually, I can still continue to do sport and, and be gay.
It's this spirit of visibility and inclusivity that the Gay Games promotes, helping LGBT athletes who no longer want to hide behind a mask.
Alright, so in this part of the lecture, we've seen that gender stereotypes can discourage individuals from participating in sport or exercise. We've seen that LGBTI individuals experience pretty unique barriers to physical activity engagement, such as homophobic perspectives, exclusion, and also discrimination. And we've also seen that inclusive sporting opportunities for LGBTI people, such as the Gay Games, help to promote positive psychosocial outcomes, such as a sense of empowerment. Alright guys, so we've covered cultural diversity and we've looked at 3 different types of diverse populations: Indigenous Australians, people with disabilities, and people of different genders and sexual identities. That's all for today.